Right. Good evening, and thank you very much, Yoeri, for inviting me. I think that politics in Europe and in the Western world is very interesting. And it's interesting because people are changing their minds all the time. People who voted one way vote another way. You find a degree of fluidity which is quite unprecedented in European political life. And for the first time, I think what I find fascinating and potentially quite inspiring is that a lot of people no longer vote in the way that they're expected to vote. I was very delighted by the Italian elections, not because I particularly like the parties, but I was very delighted that the old Italian oligarchy got kicked up in the rear end and realized that that day had gone. And when I was in Italy, I was in Lombardy recently, I was talking to all these young kids in Menaggio and in Como, and they were all buzzing and they were very excited. They were saying, we're going to make a new world. We're doing something very, very different. And it really reminded me of the morning after Brexit in England, when a lot of people in England were saying, wow, for the first time, the way we voted actually mattered. You know, for the first time in our life, we voted in a way that made a difference, whereas in the past, you know, no matter how you voted, the same old people got elected, the same old decisions were made, and it didn't really matter what had occurred. And I think that kind of sense of possibilities for me, as somebody who is what I call a 1960s person, who lived through the wonderful events of the 1960s, is like a second coming, and something that I find a little bit inspiring. And what I want to really talk about is precisely what is going on. How would I interpret what we see as the how do I see what is seen as being the populist moment? I think the populist moment should be understood very carefully, because not everything that is called populist is populist. I think these days, particularly the mainstream media calls populist anybody they don't like, anybody that votes differently than they do. Populism becomes this catch-all phrase for people that are not like us. It's a way of differentiating, you know, sort of us respectable, you know, sort of people who are aware, unlike these xenophobic, nationalistic scum that are populist. I think there tends to be this attempt to create this polarized view of the thing. Whereas, in fact, when I travel around Europe, people that are called populists are very different. Somebody who votes for Podemos in Spain, or somebody that votes for the Five-Star Movement, or somebody that votes for the Front National in France, or Hungarian Fidesz government, are very, very different. So the first point that I would emphasize is that we need to understand the context. There are some things that are very general, that are part of a wide all-European pattern, but there are also very important particular differences that we need to acknowledge and understand. I think that's really quite crucial. According to my analysis, what we're seeing is not so much populism marching forward from strength to strength, not so much a kind of a wave of new politics emerging that is, in a sense, fueled by an incredibly systematic, coherent dynamic. I think what we're seeing instead is the opposite. I think what we're seeing is something happening on the other side. And it seems to me that the key to understanding what's going on is to understand that European political life is growing through a fundamental legitimacy crisis, that the old order, the old political parties, whether they're on the left or on the right, and even that doesn't make very much sense. I don't know who's left and right anymore when I look at Holland or England. You know, sort of, they all seem to be what we would call zombie parties who, you know, call themselves socialists, but wouldn't know what a socialist looked like even if they bumped into it. And similarly, a lot of conservatives who call themselves conservatives are too scared to uphold their tradition, their values, their religion. They're really much alienated from that. So we have a lot of zombie parties, but what we're really seeing is that the old parties have really given up on communicating the ideals and the views that defined them throughout the whole post-war period. So we have a fundamental crisis of authority, of legitimacy throughout Europe. And I think that under those circumstances, where the traditional parties of the post-war era are no longer able to give an account of themselves, politics unravels. And I think it's the unraveling of politics that has given an opportunity to the Five-Star Movement in Italy, to the different parties in Holland or UKIP beforehand in England to move forward. It's not that these parties are necessarily strong intellectually or ideologically or coherent, because you can see that in the case of England, for example, one day UKIP is wonderful, it's going from strength to strength, you blink your eyes and UKIP doesn't exist. It's not there anymore. But the dynamic and the forces in society that created UKIP in the first place are still there. People are still looking for answers, and people are looking for answers that are very, very different than what they get from the technocratic, elitist, political, cultural individuals within the European Union. So I think that's the fundamental dynamic that is going on. That's the one thing that binds together Poland, Hungary, Spain, Italy, Greece, and a number of other societies. It's the crisis and ultimately the bankruptcy of the mainstream political parties, which afflicts Holland as much as any other society. I think the populist moment is also a healthy reaction against the European Union and to the European Union's oligarchy. Now, I know I'm in a minority of one when I say this, but if you look at the European Union, the European Union thinks that it represents Europe. Well, as a European, I don't recognize that. I think the European Union represents a particular set of interests and a particular group within Europe itself. And I think it's really unfortunate that we often confuse the European Union with Europe and European values and European ideals. But it seems to me that there is a very strong reaction against the EU project, the European Union project. I think that people have begun to feel that the European Union represents a form of social engineering, a kind of technocratic intervention in their life that alienates them from their everyday experience. The second thing that I think is really important, particularly in East Europe, is the EU's consistent attempt to denationalize public life. I mean, one of the things that I find quite disturbing is the way that anything that smacks of national sensibilities, a sense of belonging to a nation, of patriotism, is immediately labeled as this extreme form of nationalism. You cannot feel good about being English or good about feeling Dutch without it being the first step to being a xenophobe, without being racist. That is like a complete impossibility. The idea that somehow you feel special being French and you feel really good about that is seen as a cultural crime, and is promoted as seen as a cultural crime. And the consistent attempt to denationalize public life, to separate people's everyday existence from their national circumstances, is something that a lot of people don't feel very good about. Because as far as they're concerned, for better or worse, a large aspect of their personality and their identity is constituted by being part of a nation. And I think it's unfortunate that in the 21st century, we cannot think of nationalism without it being seen as being the equivalent of what the German Nazis did in the 1930s. It somehow immediately becomes as if somehow a national sensibility is a slippery slope towards Kristallnacht. That's the kind of ideology that the European Union has put forward, which most people with common sense are against. The other thing that I think is very much behind the movement that I'll call populist is their belief in sovereignty. And I think it's interesting that in the 21st century, sovereignty in academic circles and in European circle is seen as a bad thing. I believe in sovereignty, and the reason why I believe in sovereignty is not because I love the word or I've got this phenomenal interest in national sovereignty. I believe in sovereignty for a very simple reason that I learned through studying history that the only way that democratic rights and citizenship can mean anything is within a sovereign environment. In other words, popular sovereignty, which is the essence of democracy, is inextricably linked to national sovereignty. You cannot have democracy in the abstract. As Hannah Arendt, the political theorist, said, if you have non-sovereignty or globalism, then that represents the annihilation of public life. And I think that there's two more things that people have reacted against. One is the erosion of the meaning of citizenship. It used to be a time when being a citizen actually meant that you had special rights and responsibilities and privileges. It meant that if you're a citizen of Britain or Holland, you had a special role to play that somebody coming in from Brazil or Portugal or the United States didn't. And with the way that the immigration policies have been recast, so what has happened is that not only have people come into your country, which is fine. I think that we can interact with very many different kinds of people. But the argument has been is that people coming into your country have the same human rights as citizens as you do. And gradually, the responsibilities and the privileges that are associated with citizenship have been flattened out. And the final thing, and I think this is the final element of the EU that people react against, is that the EU essentially has bought into the idea of the Thatcherite idea of TINA, there is no alternative. Whether you're in Greece or in Hungary or in Italy, the Brussels people tell you there is no alternative. This is the only way that the economy can run. There is no alternative. Of course, if you study politics, you will know that if there is no alternative, there's no politics. Right? I mean, politics is about choice. Politics is about being able to make decisions and distinctions with different kinds of alternatives. So I think that that aspect is quite important. The final thing that I think drives populism, and that's something that some of you might find very difficult to understand, especially if you live in the orbit of the EU, is that a lot of people feel patronized and held in contempt by the European Union. I think when I travel in East Europe, a lot of East European people think that the EU regards them as a bunch of stupid natives, uneducated. They haven't really come to terms with their past. They haven't really learned about democracy. They haven't got our sensitive, enlightened values. To use an American expression, these people in Poland and Hungary and Romania are not aware. They're not aware of all the incredible things that we're aware of in the Western world. And I think, to me, what that really kind of speaks to is the fact that we got to understand how democracy works, and not only try to understand how democracy works, but I think the challenge that we face in the 21st century is how to give democracy meaning. Because at the moment, democracy is seen in a very instrumental way as a means to an end, rather than what a genuine Democrat would argue, which is that democracy is something that's good in and of itself, regardless of the outcome. Right? Regardless of how people vote, the very fact that people take place in the democratic process is a learning, educative, politicizing experience. And rather than blaming the people for voting the wrong way or making the wrong decisions, we should blame ourselves for not having the arguments, the clarity, the sensibility with which to get people to kind of support our particular kind of views. Thank you.
So that's interesting. So you're saying, so you actually said, well, maybe the only good thing that's coming out of the populist movement is solidarity, but you're saying, no, it's more than that. It's, if I have to choose sides, then I would choose the populist, although they might be against some other things. Do you think you have to choose sides? Are we in a moment in which it's digital? Because you could argue, of course, in a normal liberal society, the Christian baker could be all right, and the homosexual couple could be all right because they go to the next bakery. And so you can have both.
Yes.
And the next bakery is an atheist and has no problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, you don't have to choose in a liberal society, maybe, or do you have to? Are we in a moment in which we do have to side?
Well, not always. And I think that, which is why I don't always choose sides. I think there are, but there are certain issues that are very fundamental, and I think that on balance, sometimes, and it's not something I'm always very happy with, but the way that I look at it, if you take free speech, it's a very good example. Historically, people that were in the forefront of advocating free speech and freedom of expression were people that used to be called left-wing. I mean, the left and the radical movement were the ones that were pushing for freedom of press, freedom of expression.
You've been involved in that yourself.
Yes, yes. So that's the way. In the 21st century, it's the other way around. And very often it's conservative, right-wing people who are doing that. Now, they probably are doing it for selective reasons. I think both sides were very selective, because obviously, if you're Christian and you feel that your religion has got less scope for expression, you will want free speech. Right? It might not be a principled defense of free speech,
a practical,
but you will still want free speech for that. So we have a reversal that has occurred, where in many respects historically the left was much more for democracy, and it was the conservative kind of Catholic Church and everything else that were most anti-democratic. And I think there's been a reversal here. Mm-hmm. So you got to recognize that, while also being objective enough to know that that doesn't mean that they've become converted to Spinoza, John Locke, Mills, and all the other things. But this is the way that these things are at the moment.
So yes, there on many principal things you have to choose. I know that you're yourself of Jewish descent, and many of your family, of your father's family, were murdered, and your mother's family was in Bergen-Belsen. I'm not doubting that at all. No, I'm trying to get to the point in which, if you think that, for instance, populists and that the sort of the populists who are really interested in sovereignty and national sovereignty or national descent, and like you described them, are interested in their own Catholic, often values in Central Europe, and it's understandable. It's nothing, but then there comes this moment when, of course, it becomes one nation under God, and then it becomes all the sort of the same ethnicity, and it becomes. And that's sometimes very near. So wouldn't you be afraid if you say, well, if the defining level of political organization is the nation state, that we end up, in these sort of circumstances very quickly again?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you have to remember that nationalism and the ideal nation state emerges with the French Revolution. Right, and the French Revolution.
A bit earlier, maybe sometimes, but yeah.
No, I mean, that's when it kicks in. The people. The first time the people are mentioned as a homogeneous unity in the French Revolution. I don't think anybody would argue that the French Revolution was a reactionary kind of phenomenon. It opened up the world to radicalism, and I think that if you look at the 1848 national revolutions, liberalism, sort of emerges out of that within large parts of Central Europe. So there are, nationalism is highly specific, and if it leads to what one would call being reactionary, xenophobic consequences,
ethno-nationalism.
I would argue it's not the nationalism but there's other circumstances that account for that. The one thing that I think we need to understand, which is very difficult to grasp, but in many respects, some of what you would see as the unattractive features of populist movements, I see as being the mirror image of the people that they react against. I think there's a kind of caricature. In other words, if you've been told long enough that you're a xenophobe and you're a racist, then after a while you say, well, screw you, I'm a xenophobe and a racist. And
that's obvious. You say, well, you explain how it comes about. And of course, explaining is something, and understanding that process is something different than thinking it's a good idea. And I'm trying to get at that. How far do you think it's a good idea to...
Well, it's not far. I mean, national sovereignty is the foundation of democracy. So it's a good idea. Now, how people use democracy, what they make of it, is something that's an open question. And I think that if democracy leads to decisions and policies that are wrong, then it's not the fault of the democracy. It's not the fault of national sovereignty. It's the fault of the fact that the public life in that particular domain, the politicians in there, are, have got it wrong and are opportunistically manipulating or using various kind of phenomena.
Okay.
But we do need to make it, because the alternative is no democracy, no national sovereignty, and then what you're left with is a result that's far worse, because a technocratic form of oligarchical domination can never be changed. A democratic form of decision that's wrong can be changed, because you have elections, you have people that are accountable to you.
And what if the democratic process is hijacked in order to never to be reinstalled, in order to democratic process never to be reinstalled?
Yes. I mean, the wonderful and the threatening thing about democracy is that it's a risk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what the Greeks recognized this in ancient Greece, that when you allow people to vote, you don't know what the outcome is. It's a real risk. And I think that's, to me, is the buzz. I think that the risk of democracy is also an opportunity, because it means that if you trust people, if you talk to people like grown-ups rather than children, then there's always the possibility of a positive transformation. If you deny it to them, mm-hmm. then I think you end up with a worse result. And if democracy or a state is going to be hijacked, it will be easier to hijack a state for negative consequences, much easier if there's no democracy. I think that's what the lesson of history shows. The more you limit democracy, the more you confine democracy, the more you're going to end up with regressive, destructive consequences.
So you would say we ought to be more afraid of the technocrats than of the populists?
Absolutely. My first conviction is that I believe in people, mm-hmm. and I think that we need to have, as humanists, which I identify as being, we have to have a fundamental belief that people have a capacity to learn from their experience, and on a good day, human beings will do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were you surprised to find you writing this book? I mean, actually, you say so in the first pages that in a way you were surprised to find yourself on the side of very Catholic people in Central Europe. It wouldn't be sort of the... when did you first realize that did you think you shifted your opinions from sort of an international socialist, or is it just that the world changed and you stayed true to a lot of your original ideas?
Well, the context changes. Mm-hmm. The world changes. I see myself as not all that different than I was, except that the world has changed, politics has changed, the issues at stake have changed quite fundamentally. And I have changed in two important respects. I think when I was younger, I didn't realize the importance of sovereignty, mm-hmm. national and popular. I think those two things have been very important for me to reevaluate the way that I see the world. Not because I've got strong national feelings, because I'm not really anything. I'm not, I lived in England, Hungary. I'm European, basically. But nevertheless, I think that national and popular sovereignty are really important, and they're quite interconnected. I think that's been one important change in the way that I look at it. And secondly, I think in many respects, unlike in the past, I really learned to appreciate the importance of reappropriating the resources of liberalism, because I think we live in a very intolerant in kind of world. So I think that has become much more important to me than has been the case at the moment. But in other respects, I think the reason why I wrote that book was an accident. Basically, what happened was that I stayed away from Hungary and East Europe as much as I could for a number of personal reasons to do with the fact that I'd left and I didn't want to kind of butt in. But then I heard all these stories about Hungary. The stories you hear about Hungary is that anti-Semitism is so strong that it's just almost impossible if you're Jewish. Well, all that I can say is that if you go to Budapest, you have flourishing Jewish cultures, and Jewish restaurants in Budapest, unlike in Brussels or in Paris, don't have police guards in front of them, right? People come and go, and I remember being in Antwerp, going near a Jewish place, and it's full of policemen. So you go to Malmo, and if you're a Jew in Malmo, you feel a lot more uncomfortable in Berlin than you would do in Budapest. And I think that there's a kind of hysterical double standard there. You have stories about the Hungarian media. According to the stories you hear, the Hungarian media does not allow any oppositional views. But all I can say is that the left-wing media in Hungary is far more interesting and influential than in England. There are media laws in Hungary. As a free speech advocate, I'm totally against any interference in the media. But the fact that the assumption that there's a kind of a worse situation there compared to the West is a myth. And I could go on and on and on and on about the way in which Hungary builds a fence, with Serbia. That's not allowed. That's horrible to build a fence. But when the Baltic republics build a fence with Russia, that's cool. That's all right. Or when the Swedes build a fence no, that's all right. So that got me really angry because I just felt there's a really fundamental double standard there. And it's not that Hungarians are angels or beautiful people. They have plenty of problems, but I think that the stories about Hungary, I just think, are fundamentally flawed, so I wrote that book. And then I found myself getting involved in a territory that I never wanted to go into, wasn't particularly interested in. But once I was there, I wasn't going to, sort of back off.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your very open talk, for your thoughts, for your time, for the frankness of your talk, and I'm looking really forward. I was very inspired by the things you said about democracy and how important it is. I'm looking really forward, because you just mentioned before this meeting that you're going to work on a book on democracy. We're really looking forward to that. And you had a book just published 2 days ago, I think, How Fear Works. It's coming out in Holland later on, but just 2 days ago. Thank you very much again for your great talk. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.